Like your veins in front of the birds.
It's one.
Yeah, I just threw it out. He's so bad. I'm very fearful of my hair not being complete. I've grown it out for so long. That I wouldn't want it to really don't get it for your No.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I think we're like the second to last one. So last class about just not getting the like don't know how we get to the conference. Okay. So I was just taking myself, but I'm so stupid.
Doesn't bother.
How did I say that?
Sorry. That's great.
Oh, so there's something.
I don't know that one. That was
No, I'll leave you. I don't think
it.
I that I know of.
Before Stone first row.
Last year.
Someone was telling me that on my work class, it was like. Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, just about 11, I want to get underway. On Friday, we talked about the very beginning of Islam. We spent a good deal of time talking about the career, specifically of Muhammad. And where we had left off last time was in essence was Muhammad's death, which really, more so than most rulers, really presented the possibility for really catastrophe for the Muslim community. And we said that part of the unique role of Muhammad within the Muslim community was that he was both a governmental leader and a religious leader. He was a prophet at the same time. And upon Muhammad's death, the Muslim community faced a very difficult problem. How do you follow someone who was viewed as a prophet, as someone who was conveying God's word on earth? And this, in fact, was a problem that racked the early Muslim community. The eventual office that was created to be able to succeed Muhammad is something known as, the position is known as a caliph, and the larger institution is a caliphate. So basically, a caliphate is like a kingdom. What basically the early decision was that the only people who could be caliphs, and this is a term that means successor, literally, someone who comes after Muhammad, the earliest people who take this position have to have some sort of very close and really familial connection to Muhammad. So there's this trust initially that the people who are best able to lead the Muslim community are people who are related by blood to Muhammad. And in fact, they also will accept someone who marries into the family as well. So there's already some wiggle room for choosing this position. The problem, though, is that even for a very early date within Islam, the idea that these were the only people who could lead the Muslim community was a difficult one. Whereas the early caliphs seemed to behave in a way that at least later Muslims thought was very similar to Muhammad and idealized him as being the best kinds of caliphs ever, there was a little dissent among the Muslim community that some of the later successors of Muhammad would not live up to those high ideals that were supposedly set by Muhammad. And in fact, complaints begin to come in from later followers that the caliphate has degenerated. It has become a secular office alone, that later caliphs are corrupt and don't follow the teachings of the Quran as they should. In fact, some of them are even tyrants. And this ends up leading to a sustained civil war among early Muslims to decide who was the right person to lead the Muslim community anyway. What really ends up setting off this early war, the sort of one event that crystallizes these new factions that are growing in Islam, comes after the death of this man here, Ali, who was the fourth caliph, and someone who really had absolutely unimpeachable sort of standards as a caliph initially. He was actually both a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. So he was in terms of familial connections. There's no doubt about that at all. What ends up happening is, in fact, that Ali ends up being assassinated, which by by Muslims who are unhappy about his rule. And this is when Islam begins to really not only duke it out, have a civil war, but begins to the first time have very significant factions within Islam, different parties now. In early Islam, we had said that one of the main goals of Muhammad was to prevent this kind of thing. He didn't want division, he wanted everyone on the same page, but it had broken down. The two main parties that come out, and again, both of them in relationship to who is the appropriate successor of Muhammad. The first of these is known as the Shiites. And the Shiites were sort of the conservatives in some way. The Shiites taught that the only people whom we can choose to be the appropriate caliph has to still be related to Muhammad. Has to be someone, and in fact, only people in Muhammad's family can appropriately interpret what the Quran has to say, interpret how we're supposed to live our lives. And they in particular, this group was incensed by the fact that Ali had been assassinated because he was an appropriate caliph. He was supposed to be the person who was leading the community. And in fact, the Shiites even begin to say that it's not just a matter of the fact that these people are just clever, people in the family of Muhammad, but they actually have special, secret, mystical knowledge, if they're in the line of Muhammad, that ordinary people don't have. So in fact, there's actually something to be gained by being Muhammad's founding candidate that goes beyond just normal knowledge. And in fact, the Shiites say that the only people who can keep the Muslim community free from sin and error are people who are part of Muhammad's clan. In fact, some of these mystical beliefs will lead Shiites to say in later centuries that they're actually going to end up losing the civil war, but they're going to say that in the future there's this kind of messianic figure who will grow up, and he will actually be from Muhammad's line. Muhammad's line will disappear, but all of a sudden this person will mysteriously sort of come up again and once again lead the Muslim community. So there's hope even when eventually the Shiites will lose. The other point of view, and I should say, by the way, just to give you some idea of just how important Ali is for the Shiites, this is modern-day Iraq, where there's a mosque, a house of worship, in which they actually have Ali's body still, so that people will go to venerate it, go to revere it. The other point of view, the other perspective in the party in the Civil War was a group known as the Sunnis. And the Sunnis actually are much more centrist in some ways. And what they say is that you don't have to be related to Muhammad at all to lead the Muslim community. Any Muslim who's pious, who's learned, who's receptive to the message of the Quran can lead the community and can be a temporal ruler as well as being a spiritual leader. Those two are there's no special mystical knowledge that comes with being Muhammad's family. That's what the Sunnis say. In effect, this point of view, the Sunni perspective, is actually going to end up becoming a lot more popular. Far more people are going to join this party, which probably is part of the reason why they end up winning the civil war over the Shiites. And what ends up happening as a result of this is the Sunnis then are able to take the caliphate and now change this into an office that is essentially hereditary, where it's supposed to follow the son. No longer they're just looking for someone who's in Muhammad's family. And this will, at least for a time being, bring an end to the civil war. Although I should point out to all of you that many of you here today, that the Sunnis and the Shiites are still around. Which is quite interesting in a way because this is created because of a 7th century crisis in leadership, but it hasn't gone away. And even still today, Sunnis are the overwhelming majority in the Muslim community. And so the Shiites are a much smaller number, but they haven't disappeared. In certain countries like Iraq, for instance, are Shiite percentage-wise much higher. All right, so the happy end of the Civil War comes, and in fact, the Sunnis take charge. But it is fair to say that there was nothing like peace in the Muslim community. What's the difference is, after the Civil War is over, is that much of the violence, much of war within the Muslim community is no longer confined to a civil war, but they begin wars now of expansion. Wars to really to create new territories under the dominion of Islam. And many of you will know that really within the first century of Islam, it goes from what we'd seen earlier on Friday, really being in one teeny corner of the globe that was totally inhospitable, to being a major world power. Really, this is an astonishingly fast process altogether. But just to give you some idea of how this occurs, I'm just going to look at the map for a moment. Again, you'll remember from our earlier discussions, Islam really is a religion that is is centralized in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Within the first century of Islam, though, they expand both to the west and to the east. So this huge amount of territory is under their dominion. Even in Muhammad's lifetime, we think that war had to become a priority for early Muslims. And that's in part because, remember the kind of prejudice Muslims had faced from non-Muslims. And some Muslims felt that their only recourse was essentially to go on a series of raids on other merchants to be able to live. So they actually go on caravan raids. So this really, war starts in the Muslim community as being really a small-scale thing. They're basically just attacking other merchants or the caravans. But in time, this is going to take on a very different flavor. Muslims in time will begin to embrace what they refer to as jihad. And jihad is simply a term in Arabic that means holy war. And, Islam is not the only tradition that has the idea of holy war. It's become very pronounced in this first wave of expansion of Islam. Now, jihad is not simply just an actual military war. In fact, within Islam, it's also going to take on another meaning. You can actually have a jihad against yourself. You can, for instance, fight against sin internally, and so that's kind of a spiritual jihad. But the first meaning, and really the primary meaning during this period, was an actual physical war. And specifically, it starts off in the Arabian Peninsula against various other Arabic tribes who initially are not affiliated with Islam. And so, in fact, they'll begin to go to war against them. Once this battle was over, which basically the Arabian Peninsula is unified under Islam, then Muslims begin to become slightly more ambitious, and they begin to look outside of their original homeland. As we spoke about in an earlier session, the obvious first target of the Muslim expanse was the Persian Empire. I know that you knew them and you loved them, but they really fall very quickly because they already had weakened internally. And Muslims were well aware of that. And so, in fact, it's an extremely fast conquest of the Muslims managed to take the old Persian Empire. The problem, too, is that after they had done this, in the last sort of period of the Persian Empire, where they were still around, there actually had been a series of debilitating wars between the Persians and Romans in North Africa. In fact, what ends up happening then is this ended up leaving the Persians much weaker, and also the Romans. So the next stop, as soon as now Muslims have taken Persia, is to begin to go into the Roman North Africa, this region that previously had been Roman, that now very quickly they're going to set about making into a Muslim territory. And in fact, so both in the Middle East as well, all of these regions previously, right along the Mediterranean that had been Roman territories, are going to begin to surrender to the armies of Islam. And in fact, not only do they go across all of North Africa, but eventually they will end up attacking Spain. In fact, a good portion of Spain in the Middle Ages was a Muslim territory. The big question for many of the time was, how did this happen? And at least for people at the time, many of them felt that this basically spelled the end times. Really, there were people who were saying that this is the end of the world. It is fair to say that Muslims had a lot of advantages in these battles that perhaps would not have been apparent initially. And in part, we had said earlier that in the Arabian Peninsula, there were way too many people and too few resources. And in fact, that overpopulation actually helped a lot because they had a lot of people to go to war, and they had nothing to come back to. So if they didn't actually conquer something for themselves, then they didn't want to go back to the Arabian Peninsula. So it made a lot of sense to want to fight and gain their own land. We also think that there's a desire for honor through war, or just simply for money. So that's another cause. Muhammad, while in his life, too, would also preach that jihad was a positive thing, and that if you died in the course of the battle, you would go directly to heaven. So even if you lost in an earthly sphere, you'd still be able to achieve salvation. So I agree with that as well. We also think that at least some of these territories that Muslims are attacking were disaffected by their own rulers. We had said, for instance, the Persians tended to hate, the subjects of the Persian Empire hated their emperors. In Spain, we know, for instance, there was a large population of Jews that were persecuted by the rulers. So in places like this, they were not necessarily unhappy to see a change in leadership. They could, roll the dice with whoever was conquering us and see what happens. On top of all of these other things, we think that Muslims were very clever in attacking some of these places, because before they decided to attack, they would always allow people to surrender willingly, and they would give them good terms, which meant that in some cases, people weren't fighting. They would say, listen, we don't have a chance, so let's sit down at the bargaining table and get a good deal from them. And that's what often happened, rather than just an all-out war. In any case, though, the military success of Muslims was astonishing at its time. Just the amount of speed which they took all this territory. And certainly those people in Islam, they viewed this as a sign of God's favor. How could they have conquered all this without Allah helping them out? When the dust clears, what ends up happening is what we refer to as two major caliphates. So basically two major kingdoms ruled by two families. First of these is known as the Umayyad Caliphate, and it's kind of this ugly purple color to give you an idea of the extent of this empire. The Umayyad Caliphate, they felt that they ended up setting up shop in what today is modern Syria. This was their base of operations, a place that we think the Umayyads choose because it's somewhat close both to the old Roman world and the world of the Mediterranean, but it's not too far away from the world of the desert too. It's meant to be a balance between the two of these. That's why they like Syria. And we think too, in moving into Syria, one of the benefits of this was that they were able to take advantage of the heritage of the region they were taking over. So it's actually quite interesting that many early Muslims, when they were doing buildings, even houses of prayer, they would go to some of the same exact artists who previously had worked on churches. They didn't care. This is actually one example, for instance, of an early mosque in Syria that the Muslims have constructed. And we know some of the same artists have worked previously on churches now, use their skills for this new ruler. The other good part about taking over some of these territories that have been dominated by Greeks is that you get Greek doctors. I mentioned to you earlier how important Greek doctors were. Muslims had no trouble patronizing them as well, because they were still the finest doctors in the ancient world. Altogether, we think that the Umayyads have a glorious approximately a century of rule. Not that it is very easy to trace it. Part of the problem with them is that they do not leave back a whole bunch of sources. Occasionally you'll get something like this, one of the early palaces. Occasionally you'll get things, some writings or manuscripts like this. There's not a huge amount. And it doesn't even seem that the Umayyads seem to really care much about keeping records, which appears to us to be strange for an empire. We do think that the Umayyads care about an army, because they want to stay in power. They also care about taxation. They didn't tend to care much about some of the regular machinery of government, because, and this is another sort of clever way of ruling, when they took over regions, they just took over their system of taxation, sometimes just outright, their system of government. So for instance, they got people who had once served the Persians, and they said, serve us now. The person who's paying these Persian administrators was different. The work they were doing was exactly the same. In fact, we think that they kept all their records in Persian, which is a language that very few people among Muslims actually spoke. The same thing will occur, for instance, in some regions in which people had used Greek previously. the Umayyad said, fine, continue to use Greek. Make sure the money goes to us. But if you want to keep the records in Greek, that's fine by us. And we even see the Umayyad rulers, they really very closely overtake the coinage of Rome, including using human images on their coins, just like Romans had done before them. That was the standard that they had used. For the most part, too, again, sometimes people misunderstand jihad and think that the point of jihad is to force everyone to convert to Islam. And that's simply not true. Muslims wanted more territory under the dominion. In fact, they wanted the whole world if possible. But they didn't necessarily require that all of their new subjects convert to Islam. There is one category of people who did absolutely have to convert. And if you were viewed as someone who was a pagan in their eyes, especially someone who did not have religious scripture, then they basically gave you two choices, which was either convert or face the sword. And in that case, that actually is a forced conversion. But, this is a big but, there were large minorities, however, of other religions in the early Muslim society that were tolerated. And these are people referred to as dhimmi. Dhimmi is a term that means protected people. So who is protected under Islam? Well, any religion that was seen to have a written scripture, people, sometimes they refer to as people of the book, were allowed to continue having their religion. And in fact, we know that there were large minorities of, for instance, of Christians in many territories in Islam for centuries. The people who could apply for this special status of dhimmi were first of all Christians, second of all Jews, and third Zoroastrians, who hopefully you remember somewhere in the recesses of your mind. I should say, by the way, the Zoroastrians were also something a little bit of a dodge, in that the Zoroastrians did not actually have a lot of written scripture, but they wrote it down very quickly because they recognized that they were going to get persecuted if they didn't have it. So we actually see a lot of Zoroastrians producing scripture all of a sudden to be able to show Muslims we have scripture too. We think that for the most part, some of these early Muslims tended not to even live with people they had conquered. They lived separate from them, so they were apart from them, even assimilate. And in fact, many of them just live outside cities entirely. They live in military force, living off people. And it's really a very slow process by which there is gradual assimilation. You see Muslims beginning to intermix more with people who they're moving over. We do think, though, that you should not think that everyone was perfectly happy to be part of this new empire. We know many people, especially for religious reasons, were not necessarily very happy to be part of the new Muslim territory. We know, for instance, there were refugees who flee Muslim territories to go to Western Europe. And I talked to you about being dhimmi, and this is a standard status that people had, these protected people. But many of these people also had to live as second-class citizens. Dhimmi, for instance, had to pay special taxes for the right of being Christian or Jew. Dhimmi weren't allowed to carry weapons publicly. They couldn't hold certain offices. And so for some people, this was not worth it, even if they were allowed to practice their religion. We also think that, and this is actually the problem in Islam, Arabs, people who had come from the original homeland of Islam, were always viewed as being higher than non-Arabs. Even though, theoretically, all Muslims are supposed to be equal, that was not really how it played out in reality. And so that meant that many, even Muslims, were unhappy with the leadership under the Umayyads. And the other group that is never happy to be under the Umayyad Caliphate are Shiites, who are persecuted. So Sunnis are in the majority still, and they persecute the Shiites. What this ends up leading to eventually is a change in dynasty in Islam. from the Umayyad Caliphate to the Abbasid Caliphate, the second major family we'll study. This was in part because of all of this discontent from various groups, and it gets crystallized when, in fact, the old ruling family is invited to dinner. This is actually how it happens at the Abbasids, and the Abbasids promptly slit the throat of every single member of the family. Really watch what dinner invitations you accept. Sorry. Carl is looking slaughtered. Jokes, but in any case. So, in effect, in one fell swoop, really, this new family has taken control of this empire. In fact, this is actually going to sound like a fairy tale to you, but only one male member of the Umayyad Caliphate manages to survive, and he actually hightails it all the way to Spain, where he slices off basically that portion of their empire away from the rest of the Muslim Caliphate. So there is a survival. In any case, though, the Abbasids, although they came to power through the bloodiest means possible, they are going to be in charge, really unchallenged, for 2 centuries. And at least some people would say that this is going to represent the high point for Islam in many ways, societally and in terms of cultural. When the Abbasids come to power, one of the things that they say immediately is that we are a desert people, Muslims. And they didn't like the fact that the old dynasty had chosen to live in this kind of place that was in between the desert and the old Roman world. And so they decided for the first time that they're going to move all the operations of the government to the city of Baghdad in Iraq. And, it is fair to say Baghdad is a desert, which is the reason it was so attractive to them. But at the time when they moved the government, Baghdad was nothing, really. There was basically very little there. But just having a government there transforms Baghdad overnight to this place where 500,000 people live in the middle of really a desert. It's a totally difficult region to live in. We think that, and really, this new party that comes into power, again, this new family, the Abbasids, are going to be careful to learn from at least some of the mistakes of the old dynasty. So, for instance, the old dynasty said that essentially made Arabs more important than non-Arab Muslims. And the Abbasids are going to go out of their way to give opportunities to people who are Muslims who are not from the Arabian Peninsula, just to make it clear that everyone is equal in Islam. And as for the Shiites, though, they really got a raw end of the deal, because as soon as the Abbasids come into power, they too start to go and persecute Shiites. So really their discontent was not ended by a change in dynasty. Altogether, we think that the Abbasids really take government a lot more seriously in these very loose ways under the Umayyad dynasty. They have a much more systematic government. They have a lot more paperwork, a lot more bureaucracy. They have much more systematic taxation. The people who watch books are people who are Muslim, and they have to do all the books in Arabic now. None of this sort of like farming out all of their government machinery. Arabic also, by the way, for the first time, gets, you see, they begin to take verses from the Quran and use them on coinage. They didn't like the idea of this new dynasty of having coins that had people's faces on it. They get rid of that entirely. Now everything has to be just words, just Arabic words under coinage. And altogether, too, we think, like all of these dynasties, really, the Abbasids will also pay a lot of money and to put a lot of time into their military. In fact, their military becomes really a professional machine. This is very useful, of course, in that we think that their military didn't necessarily have to always fight, but just the threat of having the military there does create a lot of peace in Muslim territories. And some people have actually we talked earlier about the Roman peace, for instance. Some people have actually referred to in this period kind of a Muslim peace, in the Abbasid Caliphate. The army is strong enough to be able to suppress war and make it peaceful for everyone else who, for instance, just want to do business. So it actually ends up helping people who didn't have much of an interest in war to start out with. We know on top of all these other things, in many of these Muslim territories, they will really start to pump a lot of money into everyday life. For instance, we know that this is really when the Muslim world becomes known for its huge open-air markets. This is becomes a very common feature. Baths, too. Baths, what they really learned, in essence, from the Greek example, or Roman example. They begin to put these all over the place in the Muslim world as well. Another of the reason why people tend to really spend a lot of time studying the Abbasid Caliphate in particular is specifically the amount of culture that ends up being pumped out during this time period. This is really, for some people, in fact, this is actually, they refer to it as a kind of gold age for Muslim learning. I'm going to spend a lot of time here talking about essentially higher education and higher culture, but it is fair to say that the Abbasids even thought it was a good idea for everyone to get some form of education. Really, we really think in most cases a very rudimentary education, and one that really was very high on basically religious values. But it was something that theoretically, at least, that even boys and girls were supposed to get at a young age, some kind of basic schooling, which they felt the primary goal of was to build character. So it was something that was meant to help people ultimately. So what fields do people begin to study during this period? Well, one of the most obvious ones is the study of Arabic as a language, as a literature. Arabic was not a new phenomenon under Islam. It existed now for centuries, but really had not really existed in a written form. And having these learned scholars, who again very often had cut their teeth in Muslim subjects, they also were fascinated by just learning Arabic and learning its long tradition of oral poetry, of singing, these sort of things that very often were completely secular themes. They weren't necessarily always Muslim themes, but they were themes that these intellectuals wanted to preserve, and they could, because writing becomes instituted in the Muslim world. We see that now, really in many ways. I told you that wherever Islam goes, Arabic inevitably follows. And in fact, this is where people are learning a lot of their vocabulary. But as people start to study new fields, they have to create this entirely new vocabulary for Arabic. They just never had the vocabulary to study many of the subjects that people are going to get interested in. And very often they'll borrow, for instance, from languages like Greek or Persian, areas where they had studied various subjects. Now people begin to write increasingly in this very cursive Arabic script. We think too, there's this entire literary culture that grows up. And it actually becomes almost an expectation in the Muslim world that a person who is learned should be able to write poetry, and who should be able to enjoy the performances of Arabic songs and poets. So, for instance, and play things like the lute or the guitar. These are like common things that we see, for instance, going to like a dinner party or something in the Muslim world this time. There was also a lot of study of authoritative religious texts in the Abbasid Caliphate. And we're going to be talking a lot more on Wednesday about the Quran in particular, but it is fair to say that the Quran was the absolute center of all Muslim learning. Everyone was expected to know it. In fact, there's a whole school of people who just spend their time, it's like similar with the Bible in the Christian world or the Jewish world. just like trying to understand every single verse of the Quran. That's to understand, to pick it apart, really. And in fact, some of the most hardcore people would actually even memorize the Quran. It's actually a popular thing to do, at least memorize some of the Quran, and then go ahead and publicly chant it. And they'd have these kind of like Quran slams, where people would have to go publicly, and then whoever chanted it the most beautifully would be awarded the prize. We also see, in addition to simply the Quran, which is always there, there is a lot of interest in the Muslim world in learning more about the founder of the religion. And as I told you in the beginning, it was actually very strange that no one had really written for a long time a biography of Muhammad. But that really changes, and it changes to the point where it actually becomes a whole field of study to try to figure out things about the Prophet's life. And in fact, the term that they use in Arabic is hadith, a term that means traditions. And these are these kind of biographies of things of Muhammad that were written and then compiled together. In terms of just sheer biography, most people do not have a whole lot of faith in hadith because the traditions they bring together are essentially often folk tales that are claimed to be oral traditions, but in many cases they appear to be new traditions that were founded by much later Muslims. But, and this is the reason why it's so important to us today, whatever you think of the status of some of these texts as actually talking about what Muhammad did, they tell us much more about what Muslims were expected to do. Because part of the purpose of hadith was not just to, like we might say in biography, here's a bunch of things that an important person did. That was really not the purpose at all. For Muslims, the idea of talking about someone in the past was, how do I live my life? And if Muhammad is the best of Muslims, I should study every single thing he did so that I can actually live my life on that pattern. That was basically the goal. So even though the stories are legendary, they served a big role in helping people at time. We also see Muslim scholars in this period making very significant advances in math and science. As many of you know, of course, we still use the term Arabic numerals to this very day, not because Muslims created them, I should say. Arabic numerals, confusingly, were actually created in India. But the group that really popularizes them are Muslims, and especially during this period. They used to use them a lot. And, you may wonder to yourself, well, who cares about Arabic numerals? I mean, I'll take my Roman numerals any old day. And usually when students say this, I ask you to sort of multiply. This is not going to work. I get the grand. I would actually bet money that this one will not work as well, but I can do it. I don't know. I would ask you to try to multiply this times this in your head without changing these to Arabic numerals. Even try to add them is also kind of fun. And if you do just a few of these, you begin to recognize very quickly why Arabic numerals are vastly superior to Roman ones. Even more important than this, just to be able to calculate, Romans did not have the concept of zero, which Arabic numerals do. This, again, you can't really do a whole lot of math without having zeros. This is just one of the many reasons why Muslim mathematicians become so gifted at this point. They have better tools to work with. In part because Muslims also always want to know exactly where they are so they can see what the direction of the city of Mecca is. The study of astronomy also becomes a very serious science during this time period. Initially, just for a totally practical purpose, how do I know where Mecca is? But in time, this becomes something more. They just want to know about what are the heavenly bodies, how do they move. I had mentioned to you earlier that Muslims overtake a lot of these older civilizations, and as they do, they learn a lot. So, in fact, many Muslim doctors will begin to go and to look at some of the texts that were left behind by Greek doctors and incorporate their ideas. And foremost among them is the idea we said is very important for Greek medicine. Focusing a lot, not on medical theory, but on observation. How do your treatments affect your patient? And, as a result of this, Muslims are able to, for the first time, Muslim doctors can do things like they create a surgical procedure for bladder stones for the first time. And for here, the first cataracts that were actually successfully removed were in the Abbasid Caliphate. It's a neat trick. Muslims also, in many cases, will become absolutely gifted engineers, and especially if you contemplate where some of the Muslim cities were, in the middle of deserts. You can understand very quickly, while Muslim engineers spend a lot of time thinking about how do I get water to crops, or how do I do basic things like irrigation. It becomes an actual science related to study that. We think altogether, many Muslim scholars begin not just to learn about math or learn about science from the Muslim world, but in fact, any books from the Greek world, I should say. Really, any of these books from the old ancient Greek world that they get their hands on, they begin to translate now into Arabic, and really, they really build up this huge library of different works in all kinds of different subjects. So, for instance, some of the exact same people we talked about that were important for the ancient Greek world, like, for instance, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Muslims of this period will read, translate, and comment heavily on all of these philosophers. And in effect, they're really where the memory of these texts, these texts are debated, is the Muslim world. So actually, in many cases, where people in Western Europe, when they want to get a hold of some of these texts of the ancient Greek philosophers, very often where they go to are Muslims. And places like Spain, where they're both Muslims and Christians, to be able to translate them. And sometimes, when these texts make their way into Western Europe, these philosophical texts, they have Muslim commentaries attached to them. So you can read something like Thomas Aquinas, for instance. He mentions Muslim philosophers all the time, because those texts went together. And altogether, many European languages are still marked by all sorts of Arabic words that reflect the prominence of Muslims in these areas. Anytime a word starts with al, it's a pretty safe bet that it usually came from the Muslim world. Almanac, algebra, alchemy, all of these things. Certain points of technical vocabulary, like the studies of economics, like a tariff. This is something that comes from the Arabic. Many Muslim merchants will also, in some cases, they will not be the creators, but they'll be the intermediaries that will bring new ideas further abroad, and especially eventually into Europe. So, for instance, things that were created in East Asia that we'll talk about later, about like paper, clocks, certain medical innovations in drugs. All of these were things that Muslim merchants will take from China and other places in East Asia, and then they'll bring them both into the Muslim world and into the Christian world from trading. Muslims also begin to plunge into areas of art and architecture. There was a huge impediment that many Muslims face in doing art and architecture, in that in time, Muslim theologians are going to view showing the human face in art as being idolatrous and something that's forbidden by religion. And so this really forbade them ever to get very good at naturalistic kind of work or realistic work, showing what people look like. It wasn't going to happen. What's very interesting, though, is that what it did not forbid them to doing, these artists in the Muslim world, is making all these works that use a lot of geometry and things like calligraphy, the art of writing beautifully. There's absolutely no impediment to doing that. And so, in fact, a lot of great artists in the Muslim world will become things like calligraphers, learn to write beautifully. This may look to you, by the way, just like a bunch of designs, but in fact, this is actually one early Muslim building. You'll see these are actually Arabic letters. And you can just see how beautiful some of the writing becomes, that you don't even realize it's writing at some point. It just becomes, again, this sort of beautiful symbolic manifestation. In many cases, Muslims build from Christian examples. They'll use forms that they had seen, for instance, in churches. But in time, they will begin to develop their own themes. To give you just one of many examples of early Muslim building architecture, this is a mosque, a house of worship known as the Dome of the Rock. In this, you can see Muslims are beginning to experiment, first of all, with domes, just like Christians already done, but imitating their style. But we also think why the Dome of the Rock I bring out to you in particular is that the place that they choose to build the Dome of the Rock is the city of Jerusalem, and not just the city of Jerusalem, but a portion of where the old Second Temple, the old Jewish temple, had been. So this is meant to be a very symbolic spot. In essence, what Muslims want to argue now is that they have superseded both Judaism and Christianity in some way. They're actually literally physically building above these religions. But later on, all sorts of legends will build up about the Rock of the Dome. Like, for instance, Muhammad would take a trip supposedly to heaven while he was still alive. And the launching pad, really, for all of this was the Dome of the Rock. The other reason why I bring out this example in particular is that initially this spot, Jerusalem, didn't have a huge amount of meaning for Muslims in comparison to, say, like Mecca or Medina. After, however, the Dome of the Rock goes up and all these sort of stories begin to circulate about its religious significance, Jerusalem actually becomes a city now that many Muslims will view as a holy city as well, not only Jews and Christians. The final subject I'll talk a little bit about is about the inside of the Dome of the Rock. You see how script here is. The last subject I'll talk just a little bit about is the question of women in early Islam. It is fair to say that we haven't been speaking much about women, and really in some ways women in early Islam, a lot of their situation was not significantly different from before people had converted to Islam. They just adopted customs that had existed in the Arabian Peninsula. So even after the switch in religions, Islam is still a patriarchal culture. Men still got much larger inheritance. Men were still allowed after Islam to keep multiple wives, although they were supposed to keep them well. And very interestingly, much as we had said in ancient Greece, women in early Islam, especially those who had money, a lot of their lives were thought to be, they should be confined to the house. That they should be very well. There are also all kinds of legal hindrances for early women in Islam. So for instance, in a court, a woman's testimony only counts as half as much as a man. So two women have to say the same thing to have equal what one man says. If there is a change in early Islam against what had occurred earlier before people had converted, though, we think, for instance, that once Islam comes, infanticide, which had overwhelmingly struck young girls, was now forbidden by Islam. So in that respect, it is a good change. We also see that women in Islam, although not before it, could keep their own names in marriage and could actually keep property separate from the husband's property. So they could actually not have to mix all their funds. The veil for women, the early one, known as the hijab, was not actually very common in early Islam. All the Quran says that women have to remain modest, but it doesn't say how. And this was actually another custom that Muslims will adopt from some of the places that they had conquered. And that really, later on, of course, there will be much more extreme forms of covering for women, so that will come into practice. Finally, the other thing that's very interesting about early Islam is that, again, I did talk about in the Civil War, the early days of Islam. And we know that while the Civil War is raging, many of people who had previously been Muhammad's wives or other women in Muhammad's family will very often take a very prominent role in the Civil War, in some cases leading armies. After the dust settles in the early Civil War, we think women do not tend to be significant actors in Islam. All right, folks, we'll continue on Wednesday talking about the Quran. I'll see you then. Thank you.